Hello, you're listening to Send in the Experts with Georgina Durrant. This podcast is all about teaching and supporting children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND. My name is Georgina Durrant. I'm the host of this podcast brought to you by Twinkle SEND. As a former teacher and Senko myself, I want to create a platform to share some of the amazing things that my guests are doing to support learners with SEND. So whether you're listening on your commute, tuning in whilst walking your dog, or curled up on the sofa with a nice cup of coffee, thank you so much for joining us. In this episode, I am joined by Mel Fisher from the Thrive Approach. The Thrive Approach is a provider of tools and training to support social and emotional development of children and young people. It was initially a way of tackling school exclusions, but now offers a whole setting approach to supporting the right time social and emotional development for all children and young people. Mel is a trainer and relationship manager for Thrive. She explains that professionally, she was always drawn to the vulnerable children and those who struggled to make positive relationships and achieve success at school. And Mel describes herself as a proud mum of an amazing autistic son. Hi, Mel. How are you?
Good morning, Georgina. I'm very well, thank you.
Good. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited about this episode.
Yeah, me too.
So I mentioned a little bit in the introduction about the Thrive Approach, but you're the expert. So can you explain a little bit more? What is the Thrive Approach? And in particular, its use for children with special educational needs and disabilities.
So the Thrive approach is just that. It's an approach to support children to thrive. And
Yeah.
we do that by encouraging and supporting every child to feel safe in life, to feel supported by the adults around them, and to be ready for learning. So this is for every child, and it's an
Mm-hmm.
every child approach. And that means that it does work particularly well with children with SEN. So,
Yeah.
we work with all sorts of schools and settings. We've got specialist settings that are using Thrive really, really well alongside our mainstream provisions. Um, it works.
Yeah, fantastic. And how did you get involved with them? What's your background? Because you touched a little bit on it in the introduction, and how you were drawn to vulnerable children, etc. So what's your background?
Well, it starts with Harry. He's 34 now, but there was very little known about autism when
Yeah.
Harry was born, and I pretty much had to find a lot of it out for myself.
Yeah.
And I'm actually in awe of the incredible experts and the people now that are the wealth of information that is available to people. Um, but I felt, quite alone and very isolated when I was
Yeah.
a mum with Harry. Um, so that brought me into education really, because I needed to be able to work to support him and be around when
Yeah.
he needed me. So I started working in schools, and
Okay.
after a long journey of working in schools, I came across Thrive about 10 years ago, and I thought it just sounded amazing. Wanted to know more about it. Worked in a school, and I showed them, and I said, could I look at this? Could we look at this? I think it would really benefit the kids that we work with.
Yeah.
So I became a licensed practitioner, and it
Fantastic.
was transformational. I thought, why everyone should know this stuff? Why didn't I know this stuff before? And it's not rocket science. It's
Yeah.
just makes complete sense. It changed me as who I am and the way I relate to people.
Yeah.
And it really it did. It changed me. And people say that, and it sounds like such a
No, it doesn't, because things do genuinely change people. So no, I believe you on that. That's really interesting that you've done it. You've seen it from both sides as well as a parent, and also working in schools, and you can see the benefit for that. So the actual origin of Thrive, then, where did it come from? Who was involved? How did it all start?
Well, I think there's a lot in the media now about social and emotional health and mental health and well-being, and
Yeah.
I think it's important to say that Thrive is not a fad. It's not jumping on the bandwagon of this. We have been over 25 years.
Oh wow, yeah,
You know,
because you're right. It is at the moment. If you look on sort of Twitter and any other social
Mhm.
media, it is being spoken about a lot. It seems very topical. So
Yeah.
so 25 years. Wow.
So the founders, they came together down in Devon, and they all had backgrounds in educational psychology, social work, teaching, and they were all sort of approaching retirement and thinking about what children needed and what children were finding difficult and worried about the level of exclusions even back then.
Yeah.
Which is why, as in your intro, you talked about the fact that that's one of the things we do, and it's really evolved from there into this whole incredible package of support and training that we're able to deliver now.
Fantastic. And what this is quite a broad it's quite a question. What impact does it have on children? So why should people do it? Like how does it benefit pupils? How does it benefit schools? How does it benefit teachers? And what makes it effective? Why do you think it's so good?
Well, I think it's adapted from being seen as an intervention. Certainly, when I first became a practitioner 12 years ago now, it was something that was seen as a method of support in school for
Hmm.
children that were struggling.
Yeah.
And so they would be children that were struggling with their behaviour primarily. Um, and I think that the way the world has evolved is that all children are struggling. Um, I know this is a podcast about SEN, but what we're seeing is those levels are going up and up and up.
Yeah.
The registers in schools are getting bigger. More and more children are needing support. And they're needing support with such a wide range of things. You know,
Hmm.
at the moment, the thing that we are very aware of, and it's very topical, is attendance.
Yeah.
So, we're introducing Thrive into schools, we're supporting schools to support children to attend school, to achieve better, to be happier, and to have some lifelong skills really to build resilience against life's threats and challenges.
Yeah. So in terms of school avoidance, then, because that is something I wanted to ask you about, how can the approaches in the Thrive, how can the Thrive approach actually help children and families like coming to school? What does it actually like day in day out? How does it work in improving attendance and not just improving attendance for the figures of attendance, but improving it so that children want to come to school and feel happy and safe coming to school?
Mm. I suspect one of the reasons it's so difficult at the moment is because school is not a comfortable place for many children, and
Yeah.
particularly children with SEN.
Yeah.
If you are spending all day in somewhere where you don't feel you belong,
Hmm.
where you feel different, where you feel like it's a struggle,
Yeah.
and you don't feel accepted for who you are, and you don't get that people get you. What happened is in the pandemic, everything went online.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of children and young people preferred it.
Yeah. They were
They
at home and they were comfortable if they were, if they're fortunate enough to have a home where they felt safe and happy and
yeah,
could be themselves.
there was a lot of focus at the time on children that were not happy and that children
Mm.
missed school and they weren't in safe homes and they weren't in places, where they were getting what they needed. But we didn't talk about the children that actually preferred it. And
Yeah,
what we're seeing now is that all the kids that missed school were delighted to be back are back in. And they're adjusting to the new normal, whereas the children that experienced being safe at home, doing their learning
yeah,
in a way that was much more personalised and without all of the distraction. If we think about all the sensory needs that SEND children have in
absolutely.
classrooms, what they got was to sit at home in their safe space, have their safe person on screen, and do their learning. And now we've got to replicate that to get them back
Yeah.
to school.
And from a logical point of view, from kids can be extremely logical, and it doesn't it doesn't make sense to them. I think because you've why can't they still do it at home? It worked for them. They were working really hard. They were told perhaps they were told they were doing really really well with their schoolwork. Everyone was happy, and then they're back in school and they're not as happy and thinking, well, why can't I do what was working? Mummy and Daddy are still working from home, perhaps. Why
Absolutely.
can't I? Yeah. When you think of it from the child's point of view, it makes sense, doesn't it?
So what schools have got to do is they've got to work harder to get them in, and
Mm.
and that means that they've got to invite them in, they've got to welcome them, and they've
Yeah,
got to create that safety that they experienced at home within school, and
yeah,
that safety generally comes from relationship. It comes from being welcomed in the morning by somebody that knows you and is genuinely pleased to see you.
yeah,
By coming into school a little bit earlier perhaps and having a social breakfast or doing something nice before you have to get into the day, which
yeah,
then is when the challenges for most children begin as the learning starts. So it's about that special welcome. It's about what happens during the day. It's about
yeah.
recognizing what they need.
And I suppose not the heavy-handed approach with attendance that we're seeing some places, where they're the parents are in trouble, etc., like that, and they're putting stress on the parents and the families. That's not. I would guess you don't think that's the right approach.
Well, it was interesting. I was in a school yesterday and, I got involved in a debate about attendance because,
Mm.
the school had been directed, I'm not sure whereby, so I'm not gonna quote that, but the
Yeah,
school
yeah.
was directed to consider going to parents, going to the homes and talking to
Right.
the parents and meeting the children, and they were really reluctant to do this
Yeah.
because, well, certainly on their own, um, because it's tricky. Parents have got that pressure. They know they need their children to be in school, or they make the decision that they're not going to go to school.
Yeah.
But generally, most parents want their children to be in school and they want them to be happy, and they want someone to understand that. And
Yeah.
this is another part of what we do at Thrive. We don't just support the children and the staff. We also have a wider community support around working with families.
Oh,
So
brilliant. I
we
didn't
can
know
do
that.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can do that through Family Thrive. So schools can train practitioners to become Family Thrive practitioners, and they can work with parents to support parents to understand what their children need socially and emotionally.
Yeah. Oh, that's lovely. I like that you sort of, round the whole child. It's every angle. It's not just school. It's thinking about the parents, because the parents are such an important. They're the experts of the kids. They're
Yeah.
the ones that know them the best. That's really
And
good.
and from a parental perspective, I totally get that.
Yeah,
That
absolutely.
we sit so often in reviews and meetings, and you're called to the school, and you've got to have another chat about your child's behaviour, and this isn't working, and we need to do this, and parents can feel huge pressure to make their child fit in, and how do we do that? Usually by using rewards and consequences and incentives for older children, and really we're just missing the point. If
Yeah.
children felt happy, if children felt safe, and if children were met with relationship, then we wouldn't be having all these conversations about what's so tricky.
Yeah. Oh, that's really, really interesting. So we've got listeners listening in mainstream and special schools,
Mhm.
as well as alternative provisions. Is the training that you provide on Thrive different for different settings, or are you doing the same? Yeah. How does it differ? I
It's
imagine it is. It's the same.
exactly the
Brilliant.
same training. So when you come to training, that we train in small groups, and the trainers will be aware of the backgrounds of all the delegates.
Yeah.
Uh, but essentially, we're teaching the same thing, and
Yeah.
we're teaching you to support children and young people. We don't really separate it. If you've got a child who is autistic, or if you've got a child with sensory needs or complex needs, you still need to understand that behaviour is communication of unmet need, and you still
Yeah.
need to understand that every one of us needs to feel safe. And I am going to keep saying this because
No,
it's
no, please
important,
do.
that we've got this ability to know that when we go into somewhere, that we're seen and heard and acknowledged for who we are and not what
Brilliant.
we do. And so I think it's, whether we're training somebody who is in a special school or somebody's in a mainstream school, we're training the same thing. We are asking people to be compassionate, to be authentic, to be open, to be playful. We teach about using pace, to be curious,
Yeah.
to not make assumptions and judgments. Thrive is a non-judgmental approach. We know life happens. You
Yeah.
know, we know that stuff happens, and that's life, and it's about how we respond to it that's important. So our training is the
It's
same.
the same. That's yeah. So, and you've got something I believe called Thrive Online. Can you
Yeah.
explain a little bit more about that? So that's used to track social and emotional learning, I believe. So you're sort of assessing children and seeing where they're at. Is that essentially what it is? And seeing sort of emotionally that I don't know if is it like their age, sort of their social emotional. I'm guessing their social emotional age. You sort of like basing it on that and then seeing what support they need. Or
Well, when we think about your previous question, which is how does the
mm,
training differ? The actual training doesn't differ, but our
yeah,
Thrive Online might. So
okay,
the Thrive Online tool is a profiling and assessment tool.
yeah.
So every child will be profiled for their right time needs.
And is that every child in the whole school?
Yeah.
Right.
So we're able to track what children need at the right age and stage in their
Hmm.
development. From that profile, teachers and staff in schools can then look at the results, and they can see the children that are on track at right
Yeah,
time. And they can see the children that might have some unmet needs or some gaps in their lower development. And that's the work of the licensed practitioner, because the
yeah.
licensed practitioner can then do that individual profiling to look at what the children have missed at a previous developmental stage, and
Wow.
create action plans and strategies and solutions to go in and give them those experiences that they've missed now to fill the gaps.
Gosh, I bet that data is fascinating to look at as a
Absolutely
teacher, like it, or as a head teacher. I imagine looking at your whole school, and this is
fascinating.
just off the. This is just me thinking, but
Mhm.
have you noticed an impact of the pandemic on these like scores, if you like?
Yeah,
Are you noticing a difference between the kids of the pandemic, we'll call them? Do you know what I mean? Those you know, year three downwards who've completely had their complete school disrupted from when you know they year three were in reception, weren't they? When it all happened and they were out of school, so they're just starting to have their normal years in school. Are you noticing a big discrepancy between those years in school and the ones sort of year older
yeah.
ones or
Well, it's
previous years?
and it's interesting that you mentioned year three, because I'd take it a step further and I'd say it's every transition year. So
Really? Yeah.
the
Well, but yeah, you're bound to be
the
right, actually. Yeah.
reception children are not ready
No.
because they've missed vital years of social learning,
Yeah.
that what they would do being out in the community, being at toddler groups, being with childminders, being with other people other than mum
Yeah.
and dad, actually. Then you've rightly got your transition from key stage 1 to key stage 2 children, so your year 3 children that have
Yeah.
missed so much in that key stage 1.
Yeah, especially like play-based learning in particular plays a big thing for me. But yeah, play-based learning in particular, that year group's really missed out because they missed out on a lot of year one and a lot of reception. So and then they were suddenly into the more academic sit at a desk years.
And they weren't ready. They're
No,
not ready.
no, they're not.
And then when we look at the year 6s that are transitioning to
Mm,
secondary school, they're not ready. Emotionally, every child is a little bit immature based on the fact that they've missed this vital learning.
yeah,
Our Thrive Online is based on, sorry, that's a pop-up and it distracted me.
it's okay, don't
Our
worry.
Thrive Online is based on the right age and stage. So we have 6 strands of social and emotional development that are
Mhm,
based on our age. So if we think about being, doing, and thinking, they're the first 3 strands, and they're also the first 3 years of life.
right.
And all of these are the basis of our building of a healthy stress regulation system. So what happens to us in the first 3 years become the foundation for how we manage stress.
Wow.
So this is, part of the neuroscience of what we teach, which links to trauma. Um, when we think about the fact that children, say 6 to 18 months during the pandemic, this is the time in life when we imagine a toddler, when they are moving around, they're beginning to get some independence, they're beginning to realize the world is more than mum and dad, and they're recognizing faces, and the world is a really exciting place. A whole year of that was spent at home with
Mm,
maybe 2 people, if they were lucky,
yeah.
siblings, but maybe less people. And so what we've got now is a generation of children that are not curious, that are lacking in the ability to just initiate, engage in doing things, that
Mhm,
for choices. So they're coming into school and they're needing more than ever that
yeah.
co-mentoring support. They're needing that adult and the other children to say, come on, let's do this. Let's get excited. Let's go out here. Let's try this. Let's touch this, taste this. And we can see that in every stage that
Wow.
children have got missed gaps. And
Gosh, that
it's going to be fascinating as we look at the data
yeah.
over the next 10 years.
Yeah. Oh gosh, it really is. It's so different, isn't it? Because I
Mm.
remember chatting to someone who was saying, because I often think about it as the younger children. I don't know if it's because I've got younger children myself that I think of it from that way. And you do, you think of your own kids, don't you? But I was talking to somebody whose child during the pandemic had they were during the transition period of going from year six into secondary school. And it was things like they were suddenly the pandemic was over or whatever, and they were expected to be able to then they were old enough to then walk to school, they were old enough to go to the shop, but because of when the pandemic happened, they hadn't done any of that with like alongside, or they hadn't done any of those sort of helping them to do it. So suddenly they were like, but I don't even know how to use the machine at the shop, mum, and I don't know how to walk to school. And it was like this huge jump developmentally they're expected to do when they weren't ready. They were a lot more immature, and I hadn't really thought of it from the secondary school point of view, but it's just across the board. It's going to have a huge impact, or going to already have had a huge impact on development.
And when I said earlier about making assumptions, teaching and training people to not make assumptions,
No,
don't assume just because a child is 11 or 14
yeah,
or 4 that they know what to do and how to do it, because
Yeah.
they've missed it and it needs to be explicitly taught. You know,
Yeah.
we learn things by repeated experience. So the more we do something, the more secure that learning becomes. And that creates neuronal pathways in our brain, which makes it secure learning. So we talk about repeated experiences. And if we use the one about walking themselves to school, they may
Mm.
never have walked themselves
No.
anywhere, even
And
to
then
the park.
yeah, and then just because they're at that stage where they should be able to do it, they're not ready, are they?
And it's the same if we look at younger children with potty training and with
Oh,
in
yeah.
school ready for, the amount of children that are starting school wearing nappies,
Mm.
speech and language. We're
Yeah.
looking at, coming back to Zen, we're looking at children who should be able to, put a small sentence together, to say what they need, to clearly articulate, and they're not.
No. Yeah.
It's it's absolutely fascinating and worrying.
It is. Yeah, absolutely. So once they're finding this data and when they're looking at the data, the school's looking at this data and they can see that there's a bit obviously going to have been a big impact on the children that they've got in front of them, what do they then do?
So a part of the assessment is here's what we've got, here's what we
Mm.
know, and then the second part of it is creating action plans with strategies and activities.
Okay.
So we talk about strategies as being our relational part of the approach. Strategy is how we are.
Right.
So it's the most important thing. And what we say to schools is don't get too hung up on the activities. Really, how you do it doesn't matter. One of our trainers, she's in my ear always when we talk about this. Think of the Bananarama song. It ain't what you do; it's the way that you do it.
That's going to be stuck in my head now. It's going to be going round and round all day. Thanks for that.
It's just it does. It's brilliant, and it stays
Yeah.
there because it's that reminder that who we are, how we role model, how we
Mm.
respond, how we meet them in the moment of dysregulation, how we co-regulate, how we every moment with children, every interaction is an intervention. So
Yeah.
if we think about that and we think about how we are with them all of the time, what we're doing is we are creating a how to be.
Yeah. Oh, I love this. It's like
Yeah.
it's not. It's just. It's like bringing it all back to how it should be, isn't it? Rather than looking at do this intervention and do this thing with the kids and it'll be amazing. It won't. It's just like no, just be your authentic self and be kind to children and just be playful and fun and what children need more than ever now.
And it's
Yeah.
more than being kind, Georgina, because it's about, yes, kindness is important. It's absolutely important. But if we're thinking about what children need, what experiences they've missed, it's about using Thrive Online to really target that.
Yeah.
So, our action planning is really targeted and focused. So we can look at an individual, we can say what this child needs is.
Yeah.
They need relationship. That's a given. What they need is a safe, steady, supporting adult. We understand that, and that's going to happen
Yeah.
100% of the time. And also, what we could do is we could do a bit of this.
Yeah.
And so we can introduce play and we
Yeah.
can introduce creativity and we can introduce using the arts to support the learning they need to do through play. Because we know that when we're enjoying ourselves, when we're happy, when we're learning, that learning becomes secure much quicker.
Yeah.
And that's how Thrive works.
Brilliant. Oh, so you're all about play. I love that.
Absolutely all about play. We've got 4 cornerstones of what makes the Thrive approach. One of them is understanding neuroscience and the latest in neuroscience. So we're constantly evolving and checking our training and making sure we bring the most up to date in
Yeah.
that. It's so important that we use it. We've got this
Oh
amazing
gosh. Yeah.
technology and we know what's happening in brains and bodies. So let's
Yeah.
adapt.
Yeah.
Um, we've then got the importance of creativity in the arts.
Mm.
How are we going to support children to thrive? We're going to do it through play. Understanding attachment theory and understanding developmental theory.
Oh,
And when
wonderful.
we put all that together, we get our fantastic approach.
Yeah. Oh, that's I love it. I'm a big fan of play, as I think everyone knows. So I'm very happy that play is a big part of this. That's lovely. So it focuses. We've said a lot about the importance of the relationships. Can you just sort of summarize why are relationships for children in particular so important in schools? Because they are. If you've got children, if people listening, you've got children themselves, they'll know that their kids are happy when they like their teacher as well. Do you know what I mean? When they've got a teacher and they're like, I really like my teacher, or I love so and so. It makes such a difference. It really, really does. And, I know it as being a teacher myself, if the kids like you, they want to learn for you and they want to do their best for you and they're happier and they're comfortable in the class. So, yeah, can you summarize why relationships are important?
Well, I think relationships focus on what the child needs. You
Mhm.
know, if we and it's interesting really that you said, with children, relationships are we're human. We're inbuilt for connection. It's we all want to feel like we belong somewhere, like
Yeah.
we're seen and heard and valued. And when that happens, we've got the power internally to succeed and be the very best that we can be because we don't do it alone.
Yeah.
And so if you feel alone, if you feel like you don't fit in, if you feel like you have to adapt who you are to be accepted and to be seen in a group,
Yeah.
then that's a huge pressure
Yeah.
on who you are. And on top of that, you've got to try and do some learning. So when we think about the stress regulation system, there are three levels. And the very basic layer is our physiological response.
Mhm.
So when we've come across something that is tricky, that's overwhelming, a stress or a threat, something that happens be out of our control, physiologically we have a response. And what we learn very, very quickly from birth, actually, is that when we are met in relationship, when we feel uncomfortable and unsteady and something happens, when we cry and when we've got a pain in our tummy, but someone scoops us up and feeds us or cuddles us or speaks to us, what we learn is we're not alone and we can cope.
Yeah.
And so the relational approach is based on that theory. It's based on attachment. It's based on connection. It's based on we can do hard things and we don't have to do it alone.
Yeah. Maybe feel a little bit sad thinking about that because you're thinking as well the kids that do cry and they are unwell and they don't get that
Yeah.
and the impact that's going to have on development. And I suppose is that sort of yeah, and the impact sort of trauma in a sense does have on development.
Well, developmental trauma is, it's a separate, there's trauma is all sorts of trauma, but
Yeah.
developmental trauma is one of the ones, obviously, that we look at because
Mm.
what we know is if children don't have their needs met well enough at the very first stage of life, in the
Yeah.
first 6 months, and, like I said, Thrive is a non-judgmental approach. So we're not talking, people often think we're talking about abuse and neglect.
Yeah.
We're not,
No.
often we're talking about the family experience a significant bereavement, that
Mhm.
there are mental health difficulties for the parents, that they live in an environment where they don't have enough. And
Yeah.
when we look at what's happening in the
Oh
world,
no.
we look at how am I going to pay my bills? How am I going to feed my children? How am I going to keep my children warm? This is what we're talking about because
Yeah.
this kind of life that, that the background that children are growing up in, if there's illness, if mum had postnatal depression, a baby is, through no fault of anyone's, not going to get what they need well enough. And that means that there's a really rocky foundation
Yeah.
as as they come into school, as they grow and develop.
Gosh, yeah, that's
Mm.
really yeah, and like you say, we've got a sort of double whammy in a sense, haven't we? We've got the pandemic that's affected, and then we've now got cost of living crisis that is going to be impacting on so many families and causing an impact there.
It
Gosh,
goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We need sleep, we need food, we need everything to stay alive. All of that stuff that we need. We need to be healthy and we need to be cared for and we need to be looked after. And when we think about that, we need to be warm enough. We need to not be
mm,
hungry. How many children are coming to
I
school
know,
not having that
I
well enough?
know,
And the
yeah,
the trouble is that schools have got massively tight budgets and they're stretched, and they're trying to teach children,
hmm,
but they're also having to give them breakfast, and
yeah.
they're also having to make allowances for the fact that they need to get them ready for the day.
Yeah, I saw something on social media the other day, and someone had said, like, asking, "Oh, what do you do if you've got this child just coming to my class and they're misbehaving? What would be the first thing you would do?" And someone rightly put on there, "I would check if they'd had breakfast." And I think
Absolutely.
that's more and more common at the moment is you just check that, they've got their needs met at the start of the day because there's a lot of children that are coming in that haven't. And how I can't do anything after, if people can't, you can't function, can you? You need all of these things to be in place to be able to, ugh, yeah, it's quite upsetting, isn't it? And it's the thought of what's to come. It's quite scary over the winter time. So in terms of behaviour, because I've touched on a little bit about behaviour, and people's needs being met, and we're talking about behaviour being a communication of need. Behaviour can be challenging for teachers. We know that. How can the Thrive approach support teachers and pupils with this? Like, what do you do if you've got a, a class that's, I don't want to say disruptive, but you've got a class that's really chatty, or you've got a whole class that are being, how do you approach it using the Thrive approach? Like, how does it work?
So if we take the phrase, all behaviour is communication of unmet need, and we
Mm,
look at chatty
yeah,
as a behaviour, what that might actually translate as is loud and
yeah,
distracted and not focused, excited.
yeah.
Um, children as a group, they will be thinking about what's coming, what's been. So it's about checking in with the emotional tone.
Hmm.
Why is this class chatty? What are they chatting about? If they're chatting about their learning, but it's a little bit noisy, but they're really engaged in what they're doing, then great, embrace that. If
Hmm.
they're not focused and they're chatting and they're talking to each other and they're not listening, then what's happening there?
Yeah.
Is it too hard? Is what you're asking them to do beyond what they think they can manage? Is it that they're bored? Is it that they are hungry or tired or lonely? Or
Hmm.
they're, what is it? When we're chatting, what we're doing is we're reaching out for connection.
Hmm.
And if we think about that relational regulation, are they dysregulated in any way? Is there an adult in the room that's unfamiliar? Has there been a change in the routine? And these are all the kind of things when we talk about curiosity that we would be wandering into. What is the experience for the children?
Yeah.
When you get that, you can make the change.
Yeah, this is a bit I find difficult because I've taught, and I can picture classes in my head and thinking I've done a lot of this detective work, and I've been thinking like what have I done wrong, or why are they so chatty at the moment, and and it's really hard to then think, yeah, how do you sort that out using like a trauma informed or trauma sensitive approach? I find that really, yeah, I'm just being completely honest. I find that myself quite a difficult one to get my head around, because I know it's they're not, we don't want to give like sanctions, send them out, put the names on the board. I agree with that, but what do you physically do? Like if you're stood there in front of a class and they're being really chatty and they're not listening to the teacher, using a trauma sensitive approach, what would you physically do?
I would be looking at the energy levels, and if they're really fizzy, and they've just, maybe the days that they get this the worst is on wet play days and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
So I think if they were really just not settled, I might take them outside.
yeah.
Might just say, just run around for 2 minutes, or jump up and down on the spot, or let's just go into the hall, or let's go for a sensory walk. Let's do something to settle us down, because you're not ready for learning.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah,
as a class, you're distracted. Older children, I'd actually be saying this.
yeah,
What I'm noticing is that you are really struggling to focus today.
yeah,
And I'm thinking about what it is I'm teaching, and you can be playful with them. You can say, I'm wondering what it is that's happening for you guys today, because
yeah.
I've got this lesson that I really am excited to do with you, and yet you're not ready to learn. And talk to me. What's
Yeah.
happening?
Yeah, sort of get them involved in in problem solving a little bit as well, and thinking for themselves on that. Yeah, cool. So there's been a lot of conversation, sort of like what I've just said, a few sort of misconceptions perhaps, or concerns about this sort of approach. And you've said it's not the latest fad, you've been going on for 20, 25 years, so I won't ask that question. Um, some people have said, and this is me quoting things I've read on social media, that are we not just excusing bad behaviour using this sort of approach? What would you say back to that?
I think that the adults are full. I think adults are, teachers are stressed,
Hmm.
overwhelmed. They're finding it really tricky,
Yeah.
and understandably so, because they're having to deal with and more than they've ever had to deal with before.
Yeah.
What happens when we feel overwhelmed is we become rigid, and what we do is we rely on tools that work in a way that give us some control.
Mhm.
And so when we see that children are causing harm, when we see that there is disruption, we need to see a consequence for that. This has happened, and there needs to be this happening, and that's fine. If a child has made a choice consciously to behave in the wrong way,
Mhm.
then you can say, this is not okay. You need to settle yourself down and you need to focus on what I'm doing, because we know that a child is in there, they've got the capacity to think. And when they've
Yeah.
got the capacity to think, they've got the capacity to choose.
Yeah.
Difficulty is that based on everything we said about underdeveloped stress regulation systems, is that children are not choosing their behaviour. And so when they're not choosing it, how do we then respond to it? So to give you an example, if you went to Sainsbury's and
I went to
it,
Sainsbury's this morning. That's quite funny. Before the podcast. Yep, I'm there. I'm in the head. I'm there, Mel. I'm in
okay,
for Sainsbury's.
so you went to Sainsbury's, you popped in, you had a few things on your list, you're a bit short of time, and everything goes wrong. So there's a queue to get into the car park, and then when you get there, there's not many tills open, and you get what you need. You've had to compromise because the thing you really wanted wasn't there, and you've had to settle for something else. And you get to the till, and you haven't got your purse.
I know.
The way you behave in that moment is not consciously thought out.
No.
So you might just find yourself swearing.
Yeah.
Even if it's under your breath, there'll be a word that will come into your mind, and you'll be aware that you're taking that breath,
Yeah.
and that you might make a face at somebody that is not very helpful, and it's not going to solve your problem. You
I
might
feel
be
like you might have seen
eyeballing.
me at the supermarket this morning. I was doing the school run. I was stressed. I was thinking I need to get back for the podcast. Yeah. Was I on some sort of camera?
Yeah. My point is, Georgina, is that as adults, we experience these challenges and we respond.
Yeah.
And I talk to adults all the time in training, and they tell me that they stamp their foot, that they swear, that they bang things down, that they walk off,
Yeah.
that they drive too fast, and they are not kind and compassionate towards other people in that moment because it's all about them.
Yeah.
And this is the same for children. And so to go back to your question, when children are behaving like this, what we have to ask ourselves is, are they choosing it?
Yeah.
If it's a survival response, then we're going to respond to them in a very different way to if they threw a grape at your head when you turned around.
Yes.
You know, if they're being disruptive and they're trying to be funny, don't get me wrong, we could that child still needs some support, and
Okay.
there's reasons why he's attention needing. I say he because it's generally boys that do that kind of thing. That's a whole other area. But if all behaviour is communication, even the boy that throws a grape at the teacher's head
There's
needs
a reason behind it.
curiosity.
Yeah.
But it's about how we respond. And that's
Yeah.
the crucial thing. How would you want somebody to respond to you at that moment in Sainsbury's when
Yeah,
you have
with
not got your purse,
kindness.
everyone starts tutting behind you?
Oh gosh.
What you don't want is someone tapping you on the shoulder and saying, "Excuse me, we don't have that language in here. Could you leave?"
Can you imagine? Oh
Yeah.
my goodness.
What
Yeah.
you don't want is somebody looking at you and making you feel
Worse
like
than you already feel. Yeah.
you're a bad person.
Mm.
And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying
Yeah.
to say, this behaviour is communicating something. It's not helpful, and it's not problem solving, and it's disruptive, and it causes harm. All of
Yeah.
that's given. But what we're looking at is, what does this child need? Because if
Yeah.
they get it right, then they would.
Yeah. And I suppose it's even looking back, when you've toddlers, when they're having like a toddler tantrum, if you tell them off during that moment when they're not in control, it's completely pointless, isn't it? Because they aren't in control of it. It's not their conscious brain thinking about what they're doing. It's just emotion, fight or flight emotion. And there's literally no point in telling them off because they can't even hear you off and they've no understanding of what you're saying. Anyone who's dealt with a toddler will know this. Yeah, so there's absolutely nothing to be gained in that moment in telling that child off. It's afterwards, maybe tell them about, we don't do that or whatever. But in
Yes.
that moment,
No.
no.
And that's important, Georgina, because there's a misconception that Thrive is fluffy and it's just about being kind to children. And if we're nice to children, everything will be fine. And that's not the case at all.
No.
Children need boundaries.
Yeah.
Children need to know what is okay and what is not okay.
Yeah.
But they also need understanding and compassion.
Yeah.
And so when we experience something that feels overwhelming and threatening. What we want is to be met with somebody that says, "Well, that was really hard for you. I'm so sorry that happened. Can I
Yeah.
do anything to help?"
Yeah.
And in that moment, as you rightly said with your toddlers, that's not the time to do it. The time
No.
in the moment is just to be alongside and let them know they're not alone and that you
Yeah.
get it.
Yeah.
That later on, when they've got the capacity to think about it, then we can be alongside them and do that thinking with them. So what
Yeah.
I noticed earlier was you got really, really upset and you ripped up your work. And I was so sad to see that because what I'd seen before was that you were working so hard on it and I could see how hard you were trying. And something went wrong, and you felt in that moment that you weren't good enough and you ripped it up and you didn't want people to see it. And I'm so sorry that happened. And I'm going to help you manage that in the future by thinking about what you could
Yeah.
do instead.
All right, yeah. It makes so much sense. It's not, I think on social media and perhaps the news as well, media in general, there's been quite a lot of misconception. It seems to be like one side or the other. Either we're going for like sanctions and behaviour management traditional way, or we're going for this, and people have perhaps misportrayed it, like you say, as a bit fluffier than it is. But that's not what you're saying. You're saying we're looking at relationships, and yeah.
What I want is to show children how to change their behaviour, how to have helpful ways to solve
Yeah,
their problems, how to have some strategies so that when things go wrong, instead of feeling like they're alone with it and they have to survive it by themselves, to know that actually I can ask for help and
yeah.
that's okay.
And that's
And
what we want for adults, isn't it?
absolutely. And when we look at the mental health crisis, why has it happened? Because people feel they can't say. People feel that "Oh, I don't want to bother people.
Yeah,
You know,
feel alone in it.
yeah, this is my problem. It's no one else's problem. No one can help me."
Yeah.
No, that's what we hear a lot. No one can help me.
Oh gosh. Wow. Yeah. So another question, another one of these things that I've read that people are like these misconceptions. I must point out these aren't things that I think. These are just me being devil's advocate almost here, Mel. But someone said about relationships and saying that's all well and good. The relationships are great, and if you have a fantastic relationship with your class, they'll probably, they'll want to learn for you. Everything will work perfectly. But what are you not just setting up the new staff, the ECTs, the or supply staff that come into the school? How do they then teach that class if it's all about relationships?
So if I've understood the question correctly,
Mm.
what you're saying is that there is a teacher who has got a really great relationship with their class and they're happy, and then that class move on to a new teacher?
Yeah, or they're off sick and they've got a supply teacher comes in. How would that supply teacher then get the best out of those kids and the kids behave well for them and everyone be happy and learning if so much of it is down to the relationship with that teacher?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd say, and working in an SEN unit, I know how dysregulating it is to have
Mm.
somebody come in that the children don't know.
Yeah.
You know, so we, as a supply teacher, my advice to them would be, don't worry too much about the learning today. It's going to be tricky anyway
Yeah.
because they don't know you.
Yeah.
So the very first thing you need to do is get to know them.
Yeah.
So the very first thing in the day would be to so we use something in Thrive called the VRFs, which is the way that we build relationships. I haven't got time to go into it now. I would love to, but
I'd
I'll
love to too. I
I'll
feel like I
kind
could
of
just sit here for
demonstrate.
hours. Just chat to you all
Um,
day, please, Mel.
but basically what we wanna do is we wanna validate their emotional experience. So I would be saying to the supply teacher, "Go in and introduce yourself.
Yeah.
Share a little bit of yourself. Tell them how you feel about how it is for you as an adult coming into them." You know?
Yeah.
So for example, "Hello everyone. So, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry that your regular teacher who you love to be with and have such a fabulous time with is poorly today and can't be here. I imagine that's gonna be really difficult for you all, and now you've got me, somebody you've never met before and that you don't know. So let's spend a few minutes getting to know each other." So
Lovely.
learn names is the very first thing.
Yeah.
If you've got I do this in training. I try really hard to learn people's names because when we use people's names correctly, that's one of the ways that we feel valued and
Yeah.
seen and recognized. So the very first thing is learn their names. Find out how they like to be known. You might have a register that says my name is Melanie, but actually I don't like being called Melanie. I like to be called Mel.
Mhm.
And if you call me Melanie all day, I will get the sense of you're being very formal with me and you're holding me at a distance. But if you say Mel, it's friendly and that's welcoming and it's like, oh, you know who I am.
Yeah.
So another thing is making sure we pronounce names right. You know,
Yes.
we're often scared. We see a name written down and we're often scared to say, oh, how do you pronounce that? It never frightens me. I just say, how do you say your name? Help me to get that right.
Yeah. I think
Because
that's really
yeah,
important.
when we get names wrong, it's a barrier.
Yeah.
So learn their names, find out something about them. Tell me something about you that's really interesting. So this is something about me. Who would like to go next? Because what you're doing is you're creating safety in the room. You're
Yeah.
communicating to them who you are, and you're communicating that I'm interested in you and what you do. It takes time, and unfortunately, people don't often make the time.
Yeah.
But if you don't make the time, what happens is you go straight into phonics or reading, or you're numbered for you're starter for the day. And what you've got is kids going, don't know who she is, don't know who she is, don't know
No.
what it's going to be like. Is she going to like me? How's today going to go? What if I have a problem? And
Gosh,
all
yeah.
of
Imagine if
this
you could
goes
hear
through
these
your head
thoughts. Yeah.
while you're going, okay, so let's count back from 100 in sevens.
Yeah.
They're going,
This
what?
is
What
such
did
a
she
oh,
say?
that would make a brilliant video of like understanding what children are thinking when they have like a new member of staff, wouldn't it? Just like listening to their thoughts in their heads and being like, this is what everyone's thinking, whilst you're then trying to be like, now say this diagram. Yeah, it's so interesting. Wow. Yeah. So yeah, it is about relationship still, and it's just you just got to work hard at that relationship and you're right as well, because there is no if it's not you're not going to get more learning out of those kids by just skipping that relationship bit and just going straight into it and thinking, well, I've got all of this stuff, I need the teachers put all this stuff on the desk, or they've emailed this through, I've got to get all of this done. You're not going to get through it really if you haven't built the foundations of that relationship anyway, so you may as well do your relationship building.
Yeah, get to know them, let them get to know you. And also, you've got other staff in the room that might not know you.
Yeah.
And so, what the kids do is they'll be looking at the adults.
Yeah.
And the older children, especially, will be looking at the communication, the non-verbal
Mm.
communication between the adults. And you ask any 8-year-old which teachers in school like each other, and they'll say, "Oh yeah,
Oh,
they're
yeah, they
great, but
know.
they like each other."
Yeah.
And so the adults almost have to get that. They're role modeling that. If the adults that the children are familiar with, we see this particularly in SEN classes where there's a high ratio of adults. If the adults are communicating well, if they're looking relaxed, if they're smiling at each other, if they're being helpful and supportive, that creates safety in the room.
Yeah. Gosh, this is I wanna talk to you for hours, please. This is brilliant. Last main question, then I'll just go on to, like, you sharing your links and all of that thing. But another misconception or another question was, would it not be better to have more funding for mental health support for kids, like better funding of CAMS, for example, than these sort of approaches?
Of course,
All
you know
right.
that's a dead straight answer. Of course,
Yeah.
Thrive was founded long before there was a mental health crisis and funding crisis.
Yeah.
What we've seen evolve is that schools are having to become first responders. You
Yeah.
know, more and more we are having to offer in school that first level of support, which often means that we recognise it and
Mhm.
that we're aware of it, and we can put things in place while children are waiting for professional support. And Thrive, although it's a therapeutic approach, we don't train therapists.
Yeah.
But that does mean that we do give people the skills to put in that first layer of support.
Yeah.
It's really tough.
Mhm.
Waiting lists are
They're
ridiculous.
horrendous.
Um, so funding, obviously, more funding. And the government are trying. There'll be a school of thought that says they're not trying enough, but there is a pot of money available to every school in England for a mental health lead in every school in England. And it amazes me that schools don't know about this. It's £1,200.
Right.
The DfE are providing funding and training for schools to understand and have a mental health lead. And you can access that training through Thrive. You can get the funding, you can do that training. Um, I think they're trying, but so much more needs to be done. And
Yeah.
while we're waiting for so much more needing to be done, schools are having to pick up the slack, I'm afraid.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So I think there'll be people wanting to find out where to find more, Mel. So can you direct them, give them some links? I'll put these links in the show notes as well. So underneath on the podcasting and on YouTube, it'll say underneath those as well as some of our resources. But can you give us some links of how to find you guys, please?
I mean, the main one is obviously going to be the website, which
Yeah.
is www.thriveapproach.com. That website has a huge amount of information, resources, case studies, things to read, videos to look at. Just go to the website really
Yeah.
and have a look there, because I mean, everything we've talked about will be there in some form today. There's also links there where you can book discovery calls with somebody like me who's a relationship manager. If you're thinking about, wow, this sounds great, Thrive would really help me in my nursery, in my school, in my provision. That to have a conversation with me and one of our team is a very informal, this is how we are.
Yeah.
This is what we do. Tell us what you need and we'll think about it. It's, all of us are extremely passionate about what Thrive does. So website is definitely the first stop. All the social medias, you'll find us on LinkedIn. I feel like Test Alien. You'll find us on LinkedIn. But we're there. Just, put Thrive Approach in, you'll find
you'll
us.
find us.
And then individually, there's, you can follow us all individually. But yeah, we're easy to find.
Good. Well, thanks ever so much. I've really enjoyed learning about the Thrive Approach and what you're doing. And thank you for letting me be devil's advocate with some of the things and giving us some feedback on that. That was really helpful. I think lots of people will I think that will help. So thank you ever so much.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Such an interesting topic. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I've popped the links to their website plus related resources that Twinkle have on the show notes below. So do go have a look at those. And thanks again for listening to Send in the Experts with me, Georgina Durrant. Please subscribe to the podcast and help us spread the word. See you next time. Bye.